Welcome to She's Healthy, a podcast for ambitious women on their journey to become the healthiest version of themselves. I'm your host, Lori Aikman. Welcome back to the She's Healthy podcast. Today we're diving into what actually causes hypothyroidism, like what actually is going on. So if this is your first episode that you're listening to, welcome to the She's Healthy podcast. I'm your host, Lori Aikman. I am a nurse practitioner and I'm the founder and CEO of Crown Executive Health, where we help busy professional women regain and sustain their energy through functional medicine, through optimizing hormones. So on this podcast, we talk a lot about these women's health issues from a functional medicine perspective, just to help you understand your body. I find there's so many of my patients and clients are just confused about why their body doesn't feel the way they want it to, why they're having the symptoms that they're having. And maybe they're trying to do their own research on the internet, and it's just so confusing. Different people say different things, and it's hard to know what is actually true for your body. So this podcast is meant to clear up the confusion, help you get to the root cause through a functional medicine perspective and understand your body so that you can make changes and actually feel the way you want to feel. So this podcast, I like to keep these episodes at just 20, 30 minutes. So it's something that you can easily listen to, in your drive to work or something like that. And not, just easy, actionable, and just really value packed. So I do have to give you my medical disclaimer before we dive in. I am a nurse practitioner, but this podcast is for informational purposes only and does not constitute direct medical advice. So I always encourage you to glean as much information from these podcast episodes, but then work with your doctor, your provider, your practitioner before making changes to your healthcare plan. All right, so let's dive in. So again, we're in the middle of a series now on hypothyroidism. In the last episode, we talked about signs of hypothyroidism and what's showing up. Today, I want to dive into what actually is hypothyroidism, like what's going on in your body and what causes it. Because I think we know a lot about the biggest thing we hear is fatigue, right? If I saw so many women in the primary care setting when I was working in like a family practice setting who were struggling with fatigue and some other hormonal changes, and they'd want their thyroid checked. So we have that understanding, but today we're diving a little deeper into what actually causes the thyroid not to work. And then in further episodes, we're going to talk about treatment. We're going to talk about labs you should, get checked and what expected ranges we should find. So if you are somebody who thinks you have hypothyroidism, if you already do have hypothyroidism and you're on, Synthroid, levothyroxine, this still can be very valuable for you because these are things that you're not going to hear in conversations with your doctor or even with an endocrinologist, unfortunately, sometimes. So. All right, so let's talk about what actually is happening when we have hypothyroidism. So we talked about this a little bit last week, but we have the hypothalamus in the brain is like our CEO. So the hypothalamus is controlling the rest of the body. The hypothalamus then signals hormonally neurotransmitters from the hypothalamus to the pituitary. In this case, we're talking about the anterior pituitary. So TRH is the thyrotropin releasing hormone is released from the hypothalamus to the pituitary. And then it's the pituitary that produces that TSH, if you've had that lab test done, thyroid stimulating hormone. So that's actually a hormone in the brain that then signals the thyroid to make thyroid hormones. And we have two thyroid hormones, T4 and T3, thyroxine and triiodothyronine. Okay, so that's like, if you're like, what the heck did she just say? Go back and watch the first episode, right? But what I want to just give you that overview is, okay, so the brain is talking to the thyroid to produce thyroid hormones, okay, is our basic gist of things. So when we have hypothyroidism, when our thyroid is under functioning, what that means is that the actual thyroid gland is not producing normal levels of the thyroid hormones of that T3 and T4. Okay. Well, why does that happen? What is actually going on? So there's a couple different things that can be going on to cause this. So one of the big thing, and let's go major categories. One of the big things that can happen is that the thyroid is actually not producing normal levels of those thyroid hormones of the T3 and T4. And one of the reasons it can do that is because we actually have damage to the thyroid itself. And these are going to be, of course, these are going to be your more holistic things that, again, maybe you're not hearing from your doctor, talking about with your doctor. But there's I'm going to go over three like major ones that can affect your thyroid. So one is electromagnetic field. Am I saying that right? Yeah. Electromagnetic fields. So, EMF exposure. So this is, if you've ever had an x-ray done, so I worked in the hospital for many, many years. Anytime technicians or doctors or us providers, we were working with radiation, do you see them wear like the lead, right? They put on the lead, you go get your teeth, right? You get your teeth x-rayed to check for cavities at the dentist. They put that lead across your chest, and they should be putting lead across your thyroid. Well, and that's because these electromagnetic fields actually can damage the thyroid. And we see increased risk of thyroid cancers even too with continued radiation exposure. So not only do we get that from x-rays, if you are somebody who you fly a couple times a week for work and you're going through the scanner in the airport, right? They're using magnetic fields to do a visual check to see if you have metal on you, right? Things like that. So think about ways that you might be getting an increased amount of electromagnetic field exposure that could be damaging to the thyroid. Now, my personal opinion, I don't have a ton of evidence necessarily to back this up with, but what I have seen is that some people are going to be more sensitive to that than others. And I think where that comes in is some people's detoxification, how their body removes toxic exposure. Some people remove it more easily than others. So I think there's some people that their body are going to be more sensitive to EMF exposure than others. But that is something that can damage the thyroid. So maybe you've had cancer. Maybe you've gone through cancer treatment. Maybe you did work in the hospital. Maybe you worked in radiology, right? And you have had exposure. Even though you've taken precautions, you have had exposure to electromagnetic fields. I'm sure I have a patient that works in nuclear power plants. So I'm just thinking of off the wall, maybe not your common, if you have a job where you're exposed to, electromagnetic fields, that might be, something that could potentially damage your thyroid gland and leading to hypothyroidism. I will say if you are somebody that has hyperthyroidism, we are going to do an episode on hyperthyroidism just down the road from now. Just because hypothyroidism is a lot more common, and I think something that people are looking into. We're starting with that. So bear with me if you are somebody that has hyperthyroidism. But another thing that actually can damage the thyroid is exposure to chlorine and fluoride in water. So this would be, checking your water quality, right? This could be, are you a swim instructor and you're in a chlorine pool, for hours on hours a week, right? Things like that. So again, this is also something in my personal opinion and what I've seen is that, again, people's ability to detoxify, different things. When I say detoxify, it's not even removing things that are it's a bad chemical, right? Our body even has to detoxify hormones. So it's just your body's ability to remove waste. Let's think about detoxification that way. So if your body has a harder time removing chlorine and fluoride, particularly, this could be damaging to your thyroid gland. The other one is a chemical called bromide. And so bromide it's in, so let me list the things. So pesticides, also in TVs, computers, as I'm sitting in front of a computer right here, can be in drinks, can be in fruit, probably from the pesticide exposure, can be in cosmetics. But the place where we're probably going to experience it or encounter it the most is actually it's used as a dough conditioner. So anything that has enriched flour, right? So bread, pasta, cookies, cakes, crackers, anything, right? Like just go down a couple aisles in the grocery store, things that have enriched flour have likely contain bromide it's used as a dough conditioner. And so there is evidence that bromide can negatively impact the thyroid, leading to hypothyroidism. So I bring those up. Those are ones when I talk about stuff like this, I'm like, don't go and feel like now you need to live in a bubble and you can't live your life because you're now exposed to all these things. But sometimes if you're going down this rabbit hole and you're like, well, why the heck, I don't have this, I don't have that, this is okay. Why is my thyroid still not functioning? These might be some things that you are not necessarily on your radar that could have a potential to impact your thyroid function. The other thing we do have to talk about is that thyroid function is just going to decrease with age too. That is, unfortunately part of the aging process. So we do see more increase in hypothyroidism as people age. You can see it more in that, even in the older population, like elderly, geriatric population, just because that naturally your thyroid function declines with age. So just want to put that out there. But then we're going to talk about two more things. So we're going to talk about nutritional deficiencies. So the cause with nutritional deficiencies isn't actually necessarily impacting the thyroid gland itself, like those other toxic exposures we talked about. So with nutritional deficiencies, how that's causing hypothyroidism is, remember, the thyroid gland produces thyroid hormone, produces T3 and T4. So, and I talked about in the last episode, if you didn't hear it, part of the, so T4 has to be converted into T3, and T3 then acts on your cells. And there are some nutrients required for that process. Those nutrients are selenium. Iodine is also part of that process. And then there's also tyrosine, iron is also part of that process and converting from T4 to T3. And then tyrosine, which is an amino acid, is actually the backbone of T3 and T4 of those thyroid hormones. So this is, if you have, and I see this a lot on the labs, I will say, with my patients, when we're taking a look at their blood work and we're looking at their thyroid hormone levels, there can be clues that there is iodine or selenium deficiency on their labs based on their levels of T3 and T4. And what that's showing us is your body might not have enough nutrients to make adequate levels of active thyroid hormone. And so you're having hypothyroidism. You're having low functioning thyroid because you don't have adequate amounts of those active thyroid hormones. So again, nutritional deficiencies can be a cause of hypothyroidism. I will say, I'm not going to dive too much into labs today. We're going to actually do that in the next episode. But where this comes up is you might have a normal TSH. You might actually have a normal TSH, but then you might have suboptimal T3 and T4 levels because of those nutritional deficiencies. So you might be having symptoms of hypothyroidism, even though you go to the doctor and they check your TSH and they go, well, your TSH is normal. Like, you should be fine, right? It's more these other things that are affecting the active thyroid hormones. Okay. And then finally, I want to talk about so if you are somebody who has, I talked about this in the last episode, Hashimoto's hypothyroidism from Hashimoto's thyroiditis. So this is autoimmune thyroid disease. how this causes, and this is the most common cause. We think up to 90% of people in more industrialized companies, in more industrialized countries. So the US and other westernized, countries, the most common cause of hypothyroidism is Hashimoto's. In your more third world countries, the most common cause of hypothyroidism is iodine deficiency. But what Hashimoto's or autoimmune thyroid disease is a antibody. Your body has essentially made an antibody. Your body is, so autoimmune disease, let's just to preface, autoimmune disease is when your body is reacting against itself. So in the case of, again, Hashimoto's, your body has created something called thyroid peroxidase antibodies that are working. So this antibody is working against thyroid peroxidase. Okay. What the heck is thyroid peroxidase? So anything with an ACE on the end is an enzyme, and so it's involved in a chemical reaction, and thyroid peroxidase is involved in that conversion of the active hormone, the conversion of thyroid hormones. So when we have this antibody, we have, you'll see labs, if you've ever had a TPO checked, they're checking for levels of thyroid peroxidase antibodies. And what that antibody is doing is it's working against that enzyme and keeping that enzyme from converting your thyroid hormones. So that thyroid conversion is not happening. So then you're having underfunctioning thyroid because of this autoimmunity, because of this antibody presence. So that is another way. So overall, I guess the big takeaway from this is that, like, if you have hypothyroidism, what the heck is going on? It's that what is actually happening is that either the thyroid itself is damaged and not producing active thyroid hormones, or the thyroid itself may be still producing active thyroid hormones, but then the activity or the activation of those thyroid hormones is impaired either by nutrient deficiencies or autoimmunity, as like the big takeaways from this. But I feel like that's helpful just because it can be, especially if you're, you're sciencey like me and you want to geek out and understand how things work, how your body works, and you have hypothyroidism, that those, depending on what your particular, diagnosis is or your circumstances, you could have, more than one of those things happening. But that is actually what is causing that thyroid to underfunction. And I would be remiss if I didn't talk about another big cause that I see in many, many women that I work with. Is that so if this is the first podcast episode you're listening to, what I talk about a lot is in busy working professional women that I work with, in my practice, what I see is that they have a dysregulated stress response. So they think high cortisol levels, right? Or if you've listened to lots of the podcasts, sometimes we're actually looking at low cortisol levels. But basically, the fight or flight response is triggered by being just in demand. It's not necessarily that you could have, very psychological, stressful things going on, personal things, professional things, health things like that. But what I find is that a lot of women they just wear many hats. They are mom, they are, boss, they are whatever. They're taking on all the things, and just those demands on their bodies then have dysregulated that stress response, which is also part of that HPA axis that I talked about earlier. I'm sorry, I talked about the HPT axis. So now but essentially affecting that, the hypothalamus pituitary, but then affecting the adrenals. So when we have a dysregulated nervous system, when we're in fight or flight a lot, what happens is that we can have also a decreased conversion of T4 to T3. And this can also, this can also affect your clearance of cortisol. And so sometimes what I see in my clients is that when we look at their testing, they have suboptimal thyroid levels. Maybe their TSH is normal. Again, like we talked about, maybe they're, so they go to their doctor, say, I'm having all these symptoms. They get their TSH checked. Their doctor says your TSH is normal. But then when we look at the T3 and T4 and those other levels, what we see is that there's an impair in that conversion, again, from T3 to T4. So what that stress response, those cortisol levels are affecting that conversion of T3 to T4. And then it can also do something called reverse. We're going to dive into labs again next week, but it also can cause an increase in reverse T3, where essentially we're having less active thyroid hormone. Again, that T3 is that active thyroid hormone. And because of the physical or psychological stress on the body, we have less thyroid hormone, active thyroid hormone available, which is showing up in those symptoms we talked in the last episode, which is showing up in fatigue and low mood and feeling cold and can't lose weight and all of those things. So I hope this was helpful. I hope it wasn't too sciencey. When I plan out these episodes, I just try to go through methodically, like, what do people need to know about this? So I would love to hear your feedback if this was helpful. If it was too sciencey, you can let me know too. But then stay tuned for our next episode. We're going to be diving into the lab tests that you actually need checked if you do have hypothyroidism and those expected ranges for that. Now, if you are a woman, if you are a busy professional woman listening to this, you're struggling with fatigue, you think it's thyroid issues, maybe you've had some lab testing done and you've been told everything is normal, I've got something for you. So starting next week on the 28th, we're hosting a 5-day workshop called Exhausted to Energized for Busy Professional Women. And if you liked this podcast, if you loved the deep dive and the understanding more of your body and how things work, this workshop is just for you. We are going to be diving through different topics each of the 5 days that affect energy levels. One of those days in particular, we're going to be diving in even more than we're going to do in the podcast to what labs, what lab values do we look for when somebody is fatigued? And what our expected ranges. So you'll get a companion workbook for that. But it's really my goal. I keep saying my goal with this workshop is for those 5 days. We'll be on camera for about an hour each day. The videos will be recorded. So if you're not able to watch live, you can watch the replay. But my goal is for those workshop days to be more valuable than your last 10 doctor's appointments. Because I talk to women all the time, who are just, again, so confused. They feel hopeless. They just feel like their symptoms maybe are their fault and they just have to live with them. Maybe they're being dramatic because there's not this education happening in doctor's appointments, in doctor's visits, and women are being dismissed. Their symptoms are being dismissed and they're just being left feeling like shit, let's be honest. So if that's you want to be on this workshop, you're going to go, I'll put the link in the show notes, but you're going to go to, or in the comments if you're watching on YouTube, but you're going to go to crownexecutivehealth.com/workshop. That simple. Register. Again, you don't have to be on the calls live. We will be sending out the replays, but you don't want to miss that workshop. So, all right, I will see you in the next episode.